Now it is time to the last intervention. It will be made in video by Madame Borowitz, who is professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs in the Georgia Institute of Technology. Welcome. She is graduated from the MIT and the George Washington University, and she is currently working on the international stakes of space policy and especially on the cooperation for the observation and data sharing by satellites. Indeed, she will speak about the EUSST architecture and its articulation with the global space surveillance. Madame Borowitz, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much for having me here. I appreciate the invitation to speak, and very pleased to be here with you in the morning for me, and I know later in the afternoon for you. I think this is, I'm approaching this issue from a different direction than the other two presentations, but I think they actually fit together quite nicely, where Sarah really gave an overview of some of the big challenges internationally for this issue as a whole. And then Julia, I think, really diving into the legal issues surrounding this. And so I'm also looking at, what are the international, what are the issues on the international level? How can we think about the way this sector is evolving? Because as you could tell from the other two presentations, it's changing very quickly. And so what I'm doing in this presentation is really looking at that network of connections of international cooperation and how that network might affect what we're able to do and how it might change over time. So this I'll do very quickly, since you've heard it to some extent in the other presentations, but just for clarity. So space situational awareness, we think of as the ability to characterize the space environment. So comprehensive knowledge of space objects, where they are, tracking them, understanding what they're doing, and being able to predict their future location. Space situational awareness also includes space weather information, although I won't talk about that in any detail here. And we need space situational awareness data for two reasons. First, to predict and prevent accidental collisions, and then also to detect and attribute, or hopefully avoid, purposeful attacks. As I mentioned, and as you saw in the other two presentations, the landscape for the space situational awareness sector is really advancing and changing quite quickly. So the US military, for many years and at present, operates the most advanced system in the world for space tracking and for space situational awareness. And it does provide, if not the underlying data, at least some of the data and the collision warnings to essentially everyone in the world, to all the space operators and other entities that are interested in that data. But there are changes that are occurring. So there are other systems that and regions and countries that already have their own system and are advancing those, or that are building new systems. So Russia, Europe, India, China, all have existing systems that they are making improvements to and growing. There are private entities, as we've heard, that are already starting to provide space situational awareness services to users around the world. There are academic and nonprofit organizations getting involved that have slightly different approaches and different goals with respect to this sector. And as you just heard from Julia, there is the transition of at least some of the space situational awareness tasks in the United States from the Department of Defense to the Department of Commerce. That could easily be its own presentation, and I'm happy to chat more about that in the Q&A. It's something very much in flux in the United States here, and some interesting political questions about if that's going to happen, when that's going to happen, what exactly it means for that transition to happen. But like I said, not the focus of this presentation, but happy to talk about it after. Okay, so when we look at international cooperation, what are the reasons that that countries are doing that, and private entities as well are getting involved in these cooperative agreements? There are two basic reasons. One is improved capabilities, and the other is shared understandings. So in terms of improved capabilities, space situational awareness relies on many different types of data. So you can have optical data, right? You're basically just looking up into space, and with the telescope, what can you see? There's radar data that provides that more active tracking, where you're sending up a signal, seeing what bounces back. You can track all day as well. Radio frequency measurements are now growing in their capabilities, and the amount that we're using those as well. And there's space-based space situational awareness, which also has some significant strengths, but is much more expensive than ground-based. So with all of these different phenomenologies, these different ways, types of data, ways of monitoring space, the more you have of those, the more different types of data you put together, the better your picture, better your capability is going to be. That's also true for geographic coverage, with these ground-based telescopes, and also with the space-based assets. Having more of them in more different locations is going to give you better coverage and better understanding of what's happening in the space environment. So if you get more data, you have, cooperate with more entities, you're going to have an improved space situational awareness capability. So that's the first benefit. The second benefit is shared understanding. So when you get these international agreements, international cooperation, it's not just data in, it's also data out, right? So you're sharing this picture of what's happening in space. It increases the transparency among the participants in that agreement. Make sure that you have that shared understanding, that common understanding of what's happening. And this is really important. So there is existing work out there that shows, if you compare specific satellites in the current US system, in the Russian system, and in, I think they looked at ExoAnalytics, one of the commercial systems, they show 3 different locations for the same satellite. And to some extent, you might say, okay, well, maybe it's relatively minor differences in the location. So, is that really a problem? But if you're talking about avoiding collisions where you care about, the exact location of those assets, or even about deterrence and attribution, and really being able to say it's these 2 elements that collided, you really want to have a common picture. And we do not have that right now. So that's another benefit, right? You want to get more data in so that your system is higher quality, but you also want to share that higher quality picture with others. So it's your understanding, your common picture, that's what everyone is seeing, and that you can get agreement upon in terms of the ability to deal with space traffic management and to provide deterrence. So some of the key questions in this area we might want to ask, with whom are nations sharing their data? Just understanding that basic, what is the state of play right now internationally? What are those partnerships? We know from the other 2 presentations, there are a lot of them, but really being able to map that is valuable. Ideally, we'd like to know what types of sensors are being networked together and how that affects the capabilities, as I mentioned. Which groups of nations are currently creating that common picture, and how many different common pictures are we having right now in the international community? How many different versions of reality might exist in terms of our perception? And then as we move forward, how can we most effectively build those partnerships? What should we be targeting in terms of which nations to work with and try to build these agreements with in the future? So the way that I approached this question was through a network analysis approach. So the idea behind network analysis is that an actor's position in a network determines, at least in part, the constraints and the opportunities that they face, and that it can also be useful for predicting future outcomes. So this is used in international relations, and it's used in lots of other fields. And the idea is that whether, if you're looking at companies, papers have used this to look at the level of innovation, the financial success of the company, things like that, based on where they are in these networks. This type of analysis also suggests that what happens to a group of actors is at least in part a function of the structure of the connections among them. So whether this sector is going to function efficiently, for example, is in part depends on how it's put together, right? And you can imagine that with this issue of common pictures, right? Do we have one common picture internationally? Do we have three? Where are, what are those centered among? Do we have 15 different pictures? What is the state of play, and how does that affect our ability to understand each other internationally? So for the space situational awareness sector, in the analysis I put together, I have 74 nodes. So these are any organization, it can be a government office, it can be an international organization, it can be a commercial entity. 74 of those nodes are involved in the analysis. You can see here that the breakdown, 42 of them are governments, entities, 25 are commercial, 5 are international, 2 are nonprofit organizations. One thing that's useful to know for satellite operators, lots of individual satellite operators use this data. I collapsed all of those down to one node, so I don't have a node for each individual satellite operator out there. That would just swamp the analysis. But you can tell who is serving kind of that private sector operators. These entities are associated with about 44 countries, and the majority of them, 52 of the 74, are generating at least some of their own data that they can contribute to the system, as opposed to just being entities that taking in system. And then I have directed connections, so meaning if there's a line from node A to node B with an arrow pointing one direction, that would mean node A is providing data to node B. If node B also provides data back to node A, you'll see another arrow going in the opposite direction. And I have about 274 of those in the analysis. And I can talk more about how that was put together, but just so you have a basic idea of what this analysis entails. A couple observations just when you create this diagram, and I'm sorry that you probably can't read the words on there. I can try and blow it up a little bit later if people are interested, or send you the underlying paper from this. There are some nodes that have no connections. So these are companies, for example, that have announced plans to be involved in this sector, but are not yet selling their products. So they have not yet connected to other entities. You can see the US is this bigger purple circle in the middle, clearly has a central role here. But there are other clusters that are visually apparent. So you can see the European Space Agency and the European Union up over here. ISON, which is the kind of Russian-led international organization, and then APSCO down over here, the international organization run by China. And then also some level of commercial coordination as well. When you look at this analysis, you can do that visual inspection, I talked about on the previous slide, but you can also look at it numerically and actually do some numerical analysis here, where you're looking at the number of connections that each of these entities have of particular types. And so there are 4 kind of ways to think about centrality, to think about how central a particular actor is to this global network. And I'm going to talk about each of these in turn just briefly. So the first is degree centrality. This is really just measuring the number of connections, the number of lines coming in or out of your entity, of your country or commercial entity. And so you can see the entity with the largest number of connections is the United States, followed by ESA and then the European Union. You see individual European nations on there, ISON, the Russian system. So, this is just showing who's kind of in the easiest way to measure just the number of connections, where's the largest. You can also break that down, degree centrality, into in degree centrality or out degree centrality. So in degree, as you mentioned, is looking at who has the most connections coming in, right? So who's bringing in data from the most different entities. Again, the United States are kind of across the board. We know they're the big player at the moment. So, we're always seeing them at the top, have the most coming in. ESA behind that. France then jumps up to 3rd place by this measure. And then you see individual satellite operators. So this tells you these are the entities that are taking advantage of lots of different types of data, lots of different data sources, and really trying to bring those together and have that high quality, that really good capability for SSA. So they're leveraging international cooperations in that way. The fact that we see individual satellite operators here is interesting. That suggests that the operators are not, for example, just going to the US for their data. They really are open to many different sources of data, which is a good sign for this emerging commercial sector. The satellite operators want to use these different sources. Out degree centrality, that really speaks to, who's using your data, who's getting your common picture, as we talked about earlier. And there again, we see the United States at the head, followed by ESA, and then the European Union high up again, and then other international organizations. So IceCat coming out of Europe as well, and then ISON from Russia. So these are entities that are really emphasizing sharing their data, getting their data out, and making sure other entities in the sector are using their picture, their understanding of the space environment. And you can see some at the bottom here, Exoanalytic Solutions, Leo Labs, some of the commercial entities starting to inch their way up into this, that they're, it's the commercial vision of what's happening in space, Space Data Association as well. It's that commercial vision that is potentially being used as the global picture. Okay, so back to these other three. Eigenvector centrality, this is a measure that takes into account not just how many connections you have, but also how many connections the nodes you're connected to have, right? So if you are connected to other entities that are also well connected, also have a lot of their own connections, then you're going to have a high eigenvector centrality. And the idea here is not only are you well connected, but because those entities are also well connected, you're going to be able to broadcast your understanding much more broadly, right? And you're going to have that access to a lot more information, through your well-connected partners. So United States again, European Union, European Space Agency, Germany, France, all quite high on here. Partly this is reflecting the fact that Europe in particular is a very densely connected network. And the US is pretty closely tied in there. And you can see that a little bit visually as well. Because the European nations have connections through ESA, they have connections through the European Union, they have bilateral agreements with each other, and so they have multiple ways to get data from the same partners. This can be good because those tight connections really give you a strong level of understanding among partners, a really good kind of level of cooperation, of working together. At the same time, even with a large number, what looks like a large number of connections, you might not be getting as much unique data or as many unique perspectives in, since those partners are also tied to each other. So you can kind of get a little bit of talking to yourselves when you're getting these really tight connections. So pros and cons there. Betweenness centrality. So on this one, you're looking at how often does that entity fall on the shortest path between two nodes, right? So it's basically how often are you the middleman? How often are you going to be the bridge between two entities? And there's a lot of benefits to being that bridge, right? That you see the data from both sides. You are the source of data to both sides. If they want to talk to each other, they typically go through you. And here, really interestingly, we see ISON and APSCO both jump quite high. So that's the Russian entity, international entity, the Chinese entity. Part of what's happening there is ISON and APSCO have both brought in a number of partners that aren't otherwise connected to this network. So they're bringing in countries and entities that only see what's happening in space, only get their SSA picture through Russia or through China. Whereas the United States and Europe tend to be connected with others who have other sources of data as well. And so in some ways that might give these Russian and Chinese international organizations an advantage in terms of sharing their vision of what's happening, of being that key player, that key bridge between other entities. So for example, if one of ISON's partners did want to get data from the US, it might happen through a pass-through within ISON, for example. So provide some power and some leverage with that betweenness centrality. And then lastly is closeness centrality. So this is looking at the average length of the path from that entity to every other entity in the entire sector, right, in the entire network. And so what you're seeing there is if you want to get your message out, how quickly can you do that? Or if you want to get data from someone else in the sector, how quickly can you do that? You know, how many steps do you have to work through? And here again, you see the United States, European Space Agency, Germany, Spain, Italy, all popping up to the top here. So connected to a lot of entities pretty directly. Yes, a lot of European activity there. Okay, so just to wrap up, what are some of the key takeaways? So as I mentioned, you know, the US maintains the largest number of connections. They have the largest space situational awareness system right now, but there are other clusters that exist already and that are growing. And there's a lot of opportunity for growth in those sectors, really around Europe, China, Russia, and the commercial sector. So those are other clusters, other potential common pictures and capabilities that are increasing and could play a larger role. As I mentioned, there's a balance as we're looking forward to how do you continue to build out this international system. There's a balance to be had between building tighter networks. So it's relatively easy to kind of add the friend of your friend to the network, right? If there are European nations that are not yet connected to the United States, which is the case, that's an easy connection for the United States to make, for example. But in some ways it provides, you know, limited additional benefits since they're already pretty tightly tied into the agreement, into the network. You can also bring in new actors to the network, right? Go and seek out nations that maybe have a potential interest in space situational awareness, but are not really connected into the sector yet. That gives you a different kind of leverage, a different kind of power within the sector. And so I think there's a balance to be had between pursuing those two types of future agreements. And then also there's a lot of opportunity here for commercial entities. We see them already kind of moving up the ranks in terms of their capabilities, their connectedness, their centrality to this network. And as they continue to build these ties, they also have the freedom, you know, to some extent different than some of the government entities that may have trouble making certain types of connections. Often commercial entities can build a broader coalition or a more diverse coalition. So that'll be a really interesting development to watch as well. Okay, and with that, I'm happy to end my presentation and look forward if we have any time for questions or discussion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your intervention. It is interesting to see how complicated is the EUSST architecture and all the questions it can raise.
We can't hear you in the room.
Sorry.
Do you know?
Okay, perfect. Maybe you can cut off your microphone. Okay, is it good? No.
Mine is off.
And no?
Mine is off as well, but it's echoing. It must be someone else in that room.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it good right now? Do you hear?
Do we hear?
Sorry?
Yes, Simona.
Okay. Okay, so I said it is really interesting to see all the questions it can raise for the EUSST architecture. Of course, we've seen that it's quite complicated to have convergence in the member states approach. Maybe in the audience or in the chat, if you have some questions, some remarks, it is the time for a question, but also for discussion. Maybe a question for Mr. Zajac. Maybe we can give you a micro.
Yes, that's
Thank you very much. So my question is for Mariel Borowitz. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was really, really impressive in terms of research and methodology. I don't want to appear obsessed by our friends from the UK, but I'm a little bit confused in your modelization because UK here in terms of centrality, they are nowhere in your modelization. So how do you explain this kind of perhaps anomaly? It is normal. What is their strategy when it is interpreted through the lens of your modelization?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So to really give you a specific answer, I'd have to go back to the underlying data and look at what I have for the UK and what their connections are. I mean, my sense is independent, and I'm not sure, Sarah, if they're officially tied into the European system still. It sounds like they are. But my sense is that outside of that, they may not have a lot of their own independent connections. So they've got the European connection and the US connection, which are quite strong. And that is one thing that this type of analysis doesn't capture, right? Is kind of the qualitative nature of that partnership. Because I know the UK and the US are really quite well integrated. The UK is pretty well integrated into the US system. But my sense would be you're not seeing them show up in those centrality measures because they're, additional partnerships outside of those two are not that vast. I don't know if Sarah, you want to speak to that as well.
Thank you very much.
I will do, yes. And I think you're absolutely right there. The UK has, in many different policy respects and in many different trade respects, cut itself off hugely from its networks. And I think that, if you're doing a network analysis of that, that becomes really interesting, Mariel. I think actually seeing the way that the UK has cut itself adrift without making contingency plans says a lot about Brexit. And in every single policy area, but certainly looking at this. And so, as I said, I feel that Britain is absolutely stuck in between. Britain seems somewhat put out that it's not allowed to continue. They can continue, but they're no longer eligible to participate in the EU Space Surveillance and Tracking Programme, is the official statement on that. So they can continue to receive information, but almost their information going in, your sort of input rather than output, is no longer required, no longer wanted. It's become superfluous to requirements. I suppose it is just no longer a trusted partner in terms of security for the EU in many different respects. And the EU cannot rely on information to be coming from the UK, is my analysis of this. The UK is still tied in to tracking data from the US as well, but as far as I can tell, that is much more of an output. So taking information from the USA's SST system rather than having an input into that. So that will mean that the UK isn't nearly as connected on the network analysis as it could be and perhaps should be. From the realist perspective that I was looking at, the UK actually has a lot less to protect than other nations though as well. If you look at the big nations who are at the top, the big states, the big space agencies, UK currently doesn't have that level of hardware. Most of that is held by commercial entities that might be based in the UK, and certainly the UK had an input into ESA's construction of Galileo, but as a state on its own, it doesn't have the assets to protect that other states and other states and space agencies do have. So if we're looking at it from the sort of self-help perspective, there is much less incentive for the UK to be paying a huge amount into SST currently off its own back. So where we're at the moment in the UK seems to be a rewriting of the UK space policy as they decide what to do, and a rewriting of, well, not a rewriting, but a writing of reports and research into the format of SST that they want to pursue.
Okay, maybe another question by Mr. Valentin de Grange.
Hi, hello. Thank you all for your presentations, very interesting. I was wondering if you could offer some insight on the relations between the ESA and the EU, especially now that Brexit happened. If you had any information regarding that, any of you.
Maybe who want to go ahead? Nobody?
I'm happy to address that to begin with. I'm sure everyone's got something to say on it. The relationship between, are we talking specifically on SST here? The relationship between the EU and ESA is changing hugely at the moment. What I find most interesting is the EU's specific qualification recently that ESA is not a political body. And I think as we're seeing much more in terms of security and politics going on in space, you need to have that state-based political actorness. This was another notion that we were discussing last week, the notion of actorness in space, which it feels that the EU has and ESA doesn't have. I'm sure Mariel can fill us in much more fully on the network analysis of the SST structures within that, but certainly as bodies, we're moving away from seeing ESA working as an actor in space and much more towards the EU being the actor in space and ESA working almost as a contractor, providing the tenders for missions that are really sort of funded and then managed by the EU itself and the EU Space Agency held in Prague currently. So we're seeing a sea change there, definitely. Pass you over
I can try and add something. So I think it's an issue you could have some level of debate on, but my sense is that ESA got involved in this area because they have the technical capability, right? And they have the interest that, you know, as Sarah's mentioned, they have a lot of assets in space. And there's a lot of value just in the, you know, sustainability of the system, accidental collisions, things like that. And so I think they were kind of an early actor in saying, okay, we have the capability, we have the you know, the need for this, let's have an ESA system. But then there was sort of a recognition that there is a higher level of political importance and of sensitivity and kind of security element to this. And that it's not just these accidental collisions in a benign environment, but also issues of deterrence, issues of protecting military assets. And that's something that my sense is it was determined is more appropriately dealt with at the European Union level. And so there is a fair amount of overlap between the two systems. And this goes back to, you know, in the network analysis, you can see those very tight connections. It's not exactly the same, but it's pretty tight. So in terms of the types of data that's being brought in terms of the actors that have access to that data, there is a fair amount of overlap there. But I think the EU system is growing and expanding, I think becoming more the center of cooperation is my sense. Well, you know, I don't think the ESA program will go away necessarily, but it seems to me to be de-emphasized compared to the European Union.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
I also think that actually this is confirmed by the new restructuring that we had with the new space regulation, because for the first time actually in Europe, while reading it, we can see that there is a clear distribution of tasks and roles in the internal and external governance. So EU with EUSPA internal and the external EU with ESA as recognizing its full role of a technical agency. And the security component, I think it's actually a very sensitive one especially for the EU versus ESA, because there was also a huge debate about the competencies of ESA as an international, an intergovernmental organization. So maybe what would be interesting also for ESA, as actually they have done already until now, would be to help through the optional program states, ESA member states, to develop some capabilities. So for instance, some telescopes with a civilian nature, but for the real European catalog, I think that this will mostly start from the EUSST initiative rather than ESA.
I would maybe add just one thing that I think is interesting. If you look in those measures of centrality, you also see individual European nations coming up quite high in those rankings, including France, which I think also tells you it's not just the ESA and the EU and the nations just being a part of those entities. They're also independently building their own national capability. So to come up high in those rankings, that means France is also partnering independent of the European Union or the US or ESA.
Maybe.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Mariel,
go
something
ahead.
that did really interest me actually, because I know that the EU for its SST mechanisms is really drawing on the hardware of the member states. How is it split between them? How is the data managed and collected and then analyzed so that some of it is nation state data and some of it is EU data, if it is all coming from the same hardware, for instance?
But here there are not EU-owned capabilities in terms of SST, and therefore the pooling and sharing mechanism works because it's member states creating, and this they have done it through the consortium and under umbrella of the Commission, because the Commission actually helped the coordination among the different governments and to build an interoperability among the different mechanisms. And as I mentioned before, we are assisting now with the new EUSST consortium with the also next phase to a specialization of the different countries. Also linking it to their national domestic capabilities. So, but we don't have EU capabilities, and there's no plan to build EU-owned and operated capabilities. This will remain a prerogative of member states.
Yeah, and I think it's going to result, we talked about how many different common pictures are there, and what are the similarities. If you're drawing on a lot of the same data, you can potentially have different algorithms, different approaches, but probably you're going to get a European picture and a US picture and a France's independent picture that'll be relatively similar to each other because they are drawing on similar data, which again, is good and bad, right? It's nice to have those similarities, but you might assume you have three totally different systems when really they have a lot of overlap.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we can move to another question. Is there in the chat?
Yeah, I wanted to maybe continue this debate, but take it to a more political science and international relation level. What you just said was my question, in fact, Mrs. Borowitz. I think the crucial question for, first, thank you for letting us understand this very complex construction on the technical and legal level. It's very complicated, and you permit to non-specialists to be aware of what's going on. But here at the IESD, we try to understand how it will affect international relations. And the question you are asking, how many different common pictures we are creating, I think two, it's a crucial one. And at the end, we could be in the situation where it is like in the movie The Lady of Shanghai, when you have so many same women, and you don't know which is the real one. They look a lot alike, but which one is the real? That's the question. And what is interesting is that in international relation, you have the basic moves. The two basic moves is balancing and bandwagoning. So where are the small power are going to go? If there is one big common picture owned by one of the common pictures is the American one. All the small states will go to the American one, and so it will create a coalition against United States that you cannot escape. You will have to cooperate with the United States because they have the biggest common picture, and so countries will be drawn to cooperate. But if European can be a pole of aggregation, of accretion, to make a concurrent common image, that could be another, that could change the structure. And you can see it very precisely with your graphs. And that was quite mesmerizing to see. You can see how the system is evolving and toward what. And I think the exit of United Kingdom of the EU is a key question. How much it will affect the capacity of Europe to be a concurrent common image, and will it just reinforce the American common image to keep the vocabulary of Ms. Borowitz? And it's very interesting because we are here not only on the spatial domain, but really in international relation. What is going on right now, and is there is it going to be a American picture with Occidental Western allies against China and Russia, or it will be a different pole, well distributed all around the world? That's the question I think you helped to understand today.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And I think, you know, it's one that you can look at from a kind of national strategy perspective, national security or international security perspective. And, you know, from a national perspective, I would argue that that makes a strong case for the United States, that some of those limitations that Julia was talking about, you know, are we going to charge for this data? Are we going to stop producing it? It's really in the US interest to make that data free, to get it to as many users as possible, to make new connections, because they do want to be the source of that common picture, right? So I think from a national strategy perspective, a national security perspective, there's a good strategic argument to continue providing that for free and continue to improve those capabilities. I think if you look on the international side, it's, you know, what would be the ideal, you know, kind of evolution? Ideally, you know, ideally you'd have one common picture and everyone agrees upon it, and now you can move forward. But some intermediate options, you could imagine, you know, Russia or China kind of is emerging as a different cluster, as a different sort of common picture. But I think the European Union and the commercial entities have the potential to play a bridging role there. And when you are getting data from both sources and providing data to both sources, that can be one way to help bring those pictures a little closer together and make them a little more similar, which I think on an international security level is what we'd like to see. So yeah, I definitely agree. I think that, you know, looking at the numbers, looking at the network analysis is interesting, but what's really useful and interesting from it is understanding what does that mean for the international picture and where we want to go, you know, strategically for international security and national security.
For me, and from the international relations perspective, we always find that cooperation and coalitions are very easy to build and to maintain in peacetime or in cooperative times. When it becomes more difficult is in emerging security situations, which is something I feel like we could be seeing, well, we are seeing currently with the Russian ASAT test this week, trouble on the Belarus-Poland border that's being exacerbated by Russia as well. So suddenly we can't see the international relations of space in a silo. It has to be played out alongside the international relations that we see on the ground. And this is, I think, becoming increasingly clear now, when we could very easily and possibly will come to look at the Russian ASAT tests as part of a hybrid strategy that is ongoing at the moment. It is yet another way to upset the West. Now, at that point, then coalitions, especially in terms of SST, are going to have to change, and will work their way around the states that are cooperating or allying themselves to each other on the ground rather than in space. And that's something that I think we mustn't forget at any point, which I think that was a point that you were making there. The fact that international relations has to be taken into account. We can't forget international relations and emerging security issues and the fact that it's constantly changing.
Very quickly. I agree with both. I maybe just add one thing, that for the European Union, maybe we are in a privileged position because our model doesn't mean to be competitive with regard to the US one, but actually we are complementary, and that is very good because, as actually also Mariel underlined, it puts us in the position to benefit from all the different systems and to represent a bridge. On the other side, also actually this sort of regionalism that we are seeing can be beneficial, because we are in any case reducing the amount of actors that present their type of pictures. And this is good because converging different models in three main ones and less actors on the table could be beneficial in terms of negotiation, and this we have seen it also in the security debate for space. The other side, which is actually another question that can also be raised, is if we go for an international model, what will be the forum to discuss it? And that I think it's something that we should already start to address. They are starting to addressing it from the broader perspective of STM, which that's why the EU now has engaged more, and the US is running on this subject. So I think find the forum will be quite interesting. And there maybe with regard to actually the GNSS international governance can provide us with some useful examples to use.
Okay, thank you for all your remarks. I am sorry to stop the discussion right now, but you know how much food is important for us. So it is time for a coffee break. And we will go back at 4 p.m. So in 20 minutes, 10 minutes, sorry. Okay, thank you.